Hello. We are going to learn together a deep sikha. It's really a piece of nigla, a piece of Gemara, analyzing it. It's a hadran on the Maseches of Shabbos that the Rabbi said in 1962, Tafshin Chav Beis. And the only way to even get a basic grasp of the sikha, the footnotes are tremendous over here. It's a really in-depth piece of scholarship. But to even understand a basic understanding of the sikha, it's important to go into the Gemara. So the Gemara is the last page of Maseches Shabbos. Maseches Shabbos has 157 blot. So it's on Kuf Nun Zayin. And Kuf Nun Zayin Amud Aleph is where the Mishnah is, and Kuf Nun Zayin Amud Beis, which is the final Amud of the Gemara, is where the Gemara is on that part of the Mishnah. It's talking about various things you could do on Shabbos. And at some stage, after referring to annulling vows, etc., we may temporarily shutter a window on the Shabbos. In those days, some windows didn't actually have, they didn't have a piece of glass, whatever. So some of them were closed, and some of them you had to actually put in something to close the window. Why would you have to do it on Shabbos? The example he's going to bring is from Tumah, from impurity. Because let's say there's impurity that could come into the house through that hole. So you're plugging in the hole. And you're doing with something that wasn't necessarily destined to do it. So technically it could be muktzah. You weren't planning on using something to block the window. You could nevertheless do it. Says the Mishnah, Maisa, there was an incident, Bimei Aviv Shel Rabbi Tzaddik, in the days of the father of Rabbi Tzaddik, Uvimei Abba Shaul ben Batnis, and in the days of Abba Shaul, the son of Batnis, that what happened? Shepakeku es hama'or b'tafiach, in which they shuttered the window with an earthenware flask. They literally took a flask and they plugged it into the wall, into the window, into the opening. V'kashrus hamegida begemi, and they then tied an earthenware vessel with a strand of reed grass in order to determine whether or not there was a handbreadth size opening in the certain barrel. What is going on over here? Give me a moment, we'll get there. And the final words in the Mishnah is, and from their words, from this story, we learn that Poikikin Moidin B'Kaishrim B'Shabbos, that we may shudder a window, measure, that's Moidin, B'Kaishrim and tie. What is the story that happened in the day of Abba Shaul ben Batnis? So at the end of Amud Aleph, and onto Amud Beis, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav, Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav gives us the incident that happened. It's a very unusual circumstance, but it happened. There was a narrow alley between two houses. The Tumah Hisasham. And between these two houses, in that alley where there was Tumah, there was a corpse. Some form of corpse. Vigigis Sduka Munachas al Gaban. So try to imagine two houses. There's an alleyway in between, there's a corpse. On top of the corpse, kind of hanging over both houses, there's this gigis, which is a cracked barrel. Obviously quite a large barrel that it is directly over the part of the corpse. Now, that cracked barrel, there's a big significance how cracked it is. Why? Before we continue the Gemara, let's explain that. If the tumah can go out, if the impurity could come out from the corpse and could go up north, in other words, towards Shemaim, towards heaven, then it won't go to the sides. It kind of has an outlet out. So you're going to have to find out if there's a crack within that barrel on top. That's a tefach. If it's a tefach, that means the tumah escapes through that area and doesn't go sideways. However, if there's not a crack, then there is a problem that the tumah could go into various directions because it's all under one roof. So whatever's under one roof, it goes under the tumah's oil, it goes under the tumah of being under one roof. So these people in their house of Abba Shaul ben Batnis, etc., the first thing they did is they closed their hole so that the tumah cannot go in through the window. Before the person died, because after it would be too late, they had shuttered the window of the house with an earthenware flask to ensure that when he would die, no tumah would enter the house. Then what did they do? They want to know if they could obviously take the barrel out, or they're going to get impure, so they have to find out if there's a crack in that piece on the top. Then they took an earthenware vessel, a different one, which was exactly the size of the handbreadth, the tefach, and they they tied this thing to a string of reed grass, which won't get tumah. And what they did is they then try to pull the string with the barrel through the crack. If the string with the barrel through the crack can fit, that means that the opening is a tefach, and that means the tumah escaped that way, and therefore now they can take the plug out of the window, and it's all good. Leida im yesham bagigis poiseach tefach aloi, to know if there was a entrance of a tefach within that barrel. Umidivreim lamadu, and from their words we learn now it makes sense what the Mishnah says, shepoikekin umaydin v'kaishtin b'Shabbos, that you may shudder, measure, and then tie on Shabbos. The Gemara finishes off with the story. This is the final piece of Maseches Shabbos. Ula ikla lebei Reish Galusa. Ula showed up to the home of the Reish Galusa, the exilarch, and he saw Rabbi Bar Huna, who was sitting in a tub of water on Shabbos and measuring it. Amarle, he says, when did the Chacham say you can measure for the sake of a mitzvah? The lav mitzvah Amar, if it's not a mitzvah, can you do it? Amarle, he said, I'm merely misasek ba'alma. I'm not measuring for any purpose, I'm just doing it out of boredom. I'm just busying myself. That's the final words of the Gemara. Says Tosfos, on the words medida b'mitzvah de lav, the mitzvah mi amar, that on the words that Ula told Rabbi Bar Huna, he said, medida, the mitzvah you're allowed to do. Measurement of mitzvah, lav mitzvah you're allowed to. He says, b'pkika leiba inan shal mitzvah. Says Tosfos, when it comes to pkika, which is to close up the window, you don't need it for a mitzvah, like we said earlier. Eladafka b'medida b'inan shal mitzvah. Dafka, when it comes to medida, estimation and sizing, then you need to do it only, you could only do it for a mitzvah. Okay, that's the Gemara. Let's move on. Says the Sikha, in regards to the laws of Shabbos, and why that's the connection to Parshas Vaeschanan, because the commandment, one of the Aseres HaDibros, Shomer Osiyim Shabbos L'Katshay, keep the Shabbos. So we learned this Mishnah regarding Shabbos. We have to understand why, after the whole story that the Mishnah brings about Abishal ben Batnis and etc., why does the Mishnah use the three words poikikin, umaydadin, v'kaishtin, in that order? Poikikin, you could close the hole of the window. Umaydadin, you could estimate. Kaishtin, you can make a knot. You would say that that's the way the story actually happened, but it didn't. The first one happened that way. Poikikin, they first closed the window. But umaydadin, v'kaishtin, first they tied the knot of the grass to the earthenware vessel, then they passed it through the hole. So which one came first, the knot or the measurement? The knot. Then they measured to see if it's a tefach. So why don't we go if the progression of what actually took place? And the Rebbe, throughout the Sikha, goes through many, many different attempts of explaining it, etc. And he says the following. If you're going to tell me that there's a bigger chiddush in medida than kshira, in estimation, than tying, and that's why you had medida first, because it's an incredible chiddush, he says no. There's a bigger chiddush in the tying. Why? Because the measurement on Shabbos, the only reason you're prohibited doing it is because it's a ma'aseh. It's not actually a prohibition, but rather because it's a weekday thing, it's a thing that we do in the weekday, therefore you don't do Shabbos. V'zilzul Shabbos, it's a desecration of Shabbos. But tying, at least a tying she'ena bal kayama, a tying that's not going to be lasting, and that was the kind of tie that they did over here. It's a isser, it's a prohibition, midivrei seifim, from the sages. Why? Because it's similar to the biblical prohibition, the Iraisa prohibition of making a kesher shal kayama. So which one is a much more stringent law? the kosher. And therefore, the fact that you can do it, it's a bigger chiddush. The fact that you can tie a knot, even though it's similar to d'oraisa, is a bigger chiddush in the fact that you can take measurements, which is only zilzul Shabbos. Says the Rebbe, you can understand this based on connecting it to the beginning of Maseches Shabbos. Very often the Rebbe would connect the end of Masechta, Askefin Siyum Laschala, you bring the beginning and the end, Notes Tchilas B'Seifan, the beginning and the end are interdependent. What is the first mission of Shabbos? The first mission of Shabbos is about carrying. Various different kinds of carrying. Over there are cases it uses, if you recall of the Mishnah, if not, I'll just show it in short. It uses an example of a balabayis, a wealthy or a homeowner inside the house, and an ani, a poor person who comes with a basket to the entrance of the house. And the question is, who transgresses a prohibition when a transfer of wealth happens? Basically, the usher is going to give, the balabayis is going to give a piece of bread. The question is, does the ani take it from the balabayis and then put it down? So he did the akira, he picked it up and the hanacha and put it down, or the other way around, that the balabayis picked up the bread and he put it down, so he did akira hanacha. Then there's the options that one did, the balabayis did half a malacha and the ani did half a malacha. And in total there's 8 different scenarios that the Mishnah discusses. So when both of them partner, in other words, each one does half of the malacha, it's not asur midaraisa because you didn't do a kira and anacha, it's not biblically prohibited, only midivrei seifim, only from the sages. And the question is asked, we know that chatzi shir asur min haTorah, that half a shir is prohibited in the Torah. So that means even though there's a shir, for example, like kazayas, when it comes to eating a certain thing, etc., chatzi shir, even half a shir is asur min haTorah. And that's the way the Rebbe says in the footnote, that's the opinion of the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch. So over here, they did half chatzi shir, they did half a shir. But what's the explanation? I believe it's from the Ragat Shavar. The Rebbe says, if you look at the words, we say chatzi shir asur min haTorah. We don't say chatzi melacha asur min haTorah. In other words, chatzi shir means you're doing a full melacha. You're actually, let's say, eating something on Yom Kippur, whatever. So you're doing a full melacha, but just you didn't do the full shir. But over here, it's not only a quantity difference that you didn't do both parts of the malacha when you carried. One did the akira and the other one did the anacha, put it down. It's in the actual quality. So it's a chatzi malacha. So you didn't only do a chatzi shir of a full malacha, you did a chatzi malacha. And says the Rebbe, you could say the following, the same thing regarding tying. That by a tying that's not a long-lasting tying, you could ask, why is it not prohibited chatzi shir? The same thing. It's the answer you'll say is it's a chatzi malacha. It's not a chatzi shir. It's literally in the quality of the whole malacha, because you didn't have intention for it to be long-lasting knot. The quality of the malacha is lacking. We're now holding Eis Gimel. Says the Rebbe, according to this, you have to understand. We don't see by akira and anacha, in other words, if you're going to, introduction, we just said that the same principle that we use akira and anacha from the Ragat Shavar, that it's a half a malacha, the same thing you could use by knots. But by the knot, you see that you're allowed to do it for the sake of mitzvah. But you can't do half the akira or anacha, half that malacha for the sake of mitzvah. So what's the difference between the first part of the Masechta, where you do a chatzi malacha and it's prohibited, and in the end of Masechta, that you do a chatzi malacha and it's permitted, the shlerach mitzvah? Says the Rebbe, even though both of them were prohibited midivrei seifrim, it's not the same prohibition. In other words, a knot which is long-lasting was prohibited from Chacham. Half a malacha akira of anacha was prohibited from the Rabbanim, but it's not the same reason. The reason why, if you picked it up and you didn't put it down, or you put it down and you didn't pick it up, the Chachamim made it prohibited. Gzeira, Shema, Yavayu, Kol Echad Ve'echad Me'am Las Malacha Shlema B'Shabbos. We're worried maybe they're going to end up doing a full malacha on Shabbos. In other words, we're scared that it's going to lead to an isser skila, a prohibition that could lead to stoning. In other words, that serious of a prohibition. So we took you a step backwards, and we took a boundary to not only can't you do the whole malacha, you can't do half the malacha. But the reason that you cannot tie a knot which is not long lasting is because it's similar. Because it's going to last a bit of time, so even though it's not lasting forever, it's similar. It's not going to lead to the other one. It's similar to the malacha, and therefore, because it's not a gzera, maybe it will lead to d'oraisa only because it's similar to d'oraisa. So you could say that there's a difference if you need to do it with tzarich mitzvah or not. However, nakira and hanacha, which we're scared that's going to lead to an isur min Torah, it doesn't make a difference if it's a mitzvah or not. Says the Rebbe, that itself demands explanation. Why taka? Why didn't Chachamim make a gzera in a knot which is not long lasting because it's half a malacha? If we're worried that it will lead to kesher shakiyam. In other words, why didn't you have the same worry that you had by that kira nanacha at the case of the nadi? And the vadvarim kal v'chomer, and seemingly it's logical. By akira nanacha, the only way it could lead to full malacha is by you doing an entirely new thing. You're either picking it up or you're putting it down, but it's an entire new half of the malacha. But by nodding, you don't have to do anything different. All you have to do is have a different intention. Al dashi yishar ken lo'olam. You have to have intention that's going to last like that forever. So then it's much easier in a way to lead to the biblical prohibition, the d'oraisa. So why don't we? And the explanation is the following. To explain the reason why Torah prohibits a kesher shakayama, a lasting kesher, you could say the following. Tying, what does it do? It's uniting and making one, two things. When are you uniting two things into one? Only when your intention is that it will be long lasting. Otherwise, you're not uniting. As the Rebbe says, the fact that the intention that you have that will be long lasting is a factor in the actual tie. And therefore, if by the beginning you only did it as a temporary knot, so even when they're tied together, they're not tied. Because the intention defines, in reality, those two pieces of string that you put together. Are they a one or are they two? If your intention was it's long-lasting, that knot became one. If your intention is temporary, those two strings remain two. So without the das, without the intention, it's not only that you're lacking a part of the malacha, you're lacking the whole malacha. Because they're not one. You're just bringing two, like the Rebbe says, you're making two strings touch each other, which is nothing wrong. And because it's not even a part of the malacha, because the whole malacha is lacking, therefore they didn't make a gzera that it might lead to the other one. And the only reason they prohibited it is because chitzanius, at least superficially, it looks like the other one. And therefore you could take it away, l'tzarich mitzvah, when there's a mitzvah. However, the Maseches Shabbos, when it comes to Akira and Anach at the beginning of the Masechta, this malacha is minat Torah. What's the malacha that prohibited to take from a Rishus HaRabim to a Rishus HaYachid, from a general domain to a private domain, or vice versa? When something's lacking in the malacha, even though it's not a complete malacha, nevertheless, whatever you did was part of the malacha. It was a real part. It's just you didn't do 100%, you did 50%. So therefore, you're scared that it's going to lead to the other part. Says the Rebbe Noishei, that now we could understand why the Mishnah says at the end of the Masechta, Moedidin, and then Keshrin. Because we just explained that when somebody makes a knot that's not a long-lasting, it's not even a part of the malacha of deraisa, it's only because the only reason it's prohibited is because it's similar. Nothing to do with the knot that you did. It's only that the final act looks similar to the other act of a permanent knot. But by estimating, even though it's not similar to a Malacha D'Oraisa, and the whole foundation is a D'Rabbanan, because it's Uvdin D'Chayil, it's a weekday thing, it's a Zilzul. But that shows that it itself is a problem. The actual estimation in itself is the issue. That's a Uvdin D'Chayil, it's a weekday thing. Unlike the not, that there's nothing wrong, there's only something similar. So what's the bigger Chiddush? What's the bigger thing? What's the bigger Chiddush that you're allowed to do? That you're allowed to do Medida, even though it's Uvdin D'Chayil, not a not, because a not, the only issue is just for similarity. That is the Nigla part of the Sikha, and as I said, that's without really the insights of the Ha'aris and the Shuli Agilian. There's tremendous amount of footnotes. But just to basic understand the Sikha, this is what it is. Oisvav, the Rebbe now goes b'pnimis in Yonim, and interesting in the way the Rebbe explains this. Al pi Chassidus, you'll have an interesting pshat in something in the Siddur that you might have noticed. So the Rebbe first focuses on the fact that the Mishnah doesn't say that you can close it, you can not, you can estimate, etc. But it says it in a present sense. Poikikin, you do it. Moididin, you're estimating. You could close, you could make a not, etc. It's happening in a current situation. The word is a current word in a certainty, which means that that's the way you're supposed to do it. The Rebbe refers to a sikha that the Rebbe says in Chelik Yud Aleph, that according to Chassidus, why did Maseches Shabbos start with the laws of Haitzah, taking out? Because that is a principle in spirituality on all the Yisrei Shabbos. Through somebody doing a prohibition, they're taking out this world, Mershus HaYachid, from the possession of the Yachid, which is Yichidish Alelam Hashem, to Rishus HaRabim, to a world of separation, to the Prudah, which is Klippus, a world of separation and division. And therefore, Hitzah comes as a fundamental principle to the whole din of Shabbos, because literally you're taking things out. And so to the end of the Masechta, everything goes according to the end, which we're explaining something fundamental about Shabbos in all its details. The Rebbe says, we've learned in various places, from Chaim Vital, Likutei Torah, etc., the difference between 3 times in Shabbos. There's the night of Shabbos, Friday night. There's the day of Shabbos, and there's Mincha the Shabbos, Daiva, the Kol Daiva, according to the Zohar, the holiest of levels. And according in the words of Chassidus and Kabbalah, the night of Shabbos, Malchus of Atzilus, which the entire week is busy influencing the world. It goes into Biyah, into the world of B'riyah Yitzir Asiyah, to create this world and influence this world. Malchus goes up back into Atzilus. So for 6 days, Malchus went down to make Birurim, to elevate this world, etc. On Shabbos, it goes back to Atzilus. So what does the world sustain on? It sustains now on Friday night from Malchus the way it is in Atzilus, not the way it's in Biyah. It's an incredible level. But on Shabbos morning, it's even greater. You get the level of Zah, which is the level of Midas. You get the Midas of Atzilus. Chesed, Gvur, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod. And then in the time of Mincha, at the end of Shabbos, is a marriage that comes from higher, because in order to combine 2 things, you have to be higher than both. So a combination of Zah, the masculine energy, and Malchus, the feminine energy within Atzilus, you get the ultimate Yichud. The Yichud of Zah and Malchus. And that's why the Rebbe says an interesting insight regarding our Siddur. That's why Friday night we say V'yanuchu Va, Lashon Nekeva, because it's Malchus. In her, Malchus is feminine. In the morning we say in Shachris Yanuchu Vai, in him, Zah. And what do we say by Mincha? V'yanuchu Vam, them, because now they're united, now they become one entity. Says the Rebbe, because on the night of Shabbos the worlds go up, and Malchus now shines the way it's in Atzilus, therefore all the klippus, all the negativity disappear. During the weekday, because Malchus is going to elevate this world, it goes into Biyah, so there's some space, there's a Tfisas Makan, there's some space, there's an entity, there's room for them to exist, and therefore they don't get nullified. But on Shabbos, they get nullified, because Malchus is back in Atzilus, and Atzilus there's no room for Ra, like the Pasuk says, Lo Yigur Ra, there's no room for evil, and therefore the world is in a situation where klippas are non-existent. Says the Rebbe, but nevertheless, it's dependent very much on the person. even though we know that Shabbos is, unlike Yom Tov, which we set the calendar and we make Yom Tov, Shabbos, Kacha V'Kaim, it's there regardless. But nevertheless, the Rebbe brings a proof from various Maimarim, etc., that we say Lasois es HaShabbos. We don't only say Asher Bar Lekim Lasois regarding the 6 days of the week. We say in V'Sham B'nei Yisrael Lasois es HaShabbos. There's a part of us, we still have to do something on Shabbos in order to create the ultimate levels of Shabbos. And that's why the Rebbe says we become partners with Hashem in creation. One of the explanations, what do we do? What's our partnership? We're told, according to the Maimer Chazal from Baba Basra, that says, Ruach Tzfainis Eina Mesuveves, that there's 4 directions, and the northern direction of the world is not covered over. In other words, there is room for problems coming from the north. That's why the pasuk says, Mitzafei ti pasuk hara, the problems start from the north. So it's open. And that's how the klippas fit in. They come in, allegorically, they come in, according to Chassidus, through the north. But on Shabbos, what do? Poikekin. We close up the window. We close up the north. And then the Bria is complete. And that's how we become partners with Hashem. Now it's a complete Bria. And that happens immediately once we accept Shabbos. And then we go to a higher level, the level of Zah. And then we go to a higher level of the unity. And that's why we say, Leil Shabbos, as we said, we close the hole. Then we get to the level of Moedidin. What's the word Moedidin? Midah. Midas, the Midas of Atzilus. And finally, you get V'koishtin, you bind the 2, Zah and Malchus, you create the unity of 2, that they become one Yachid, the Shus HaYachid, and they become connected with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yechidei Shalolim. I hope that this 27-minute Sikha, it's quite long compared to usual, offered some insights, or at least some kind of way of understanding this very in-depth and rich Sikha.